see what happens. Do you want
to... Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I think this is working, I hope so. Anyway, welcome to our little workshop on civil society experiences from the IANA transition process. And I'm Tapani Taatvainen, NCST chair, but I must pretty much disclaim all credit for this workshop. The people behind it were mostly Arti Bhavana, sitting on the middle of the aisle, Gangesh Varma, who unfortunately is not present, Martin Silva is on the right. Yeah, I hope they get the screen fixed. Anyway, we can't wait. Okay, now it's right. I asked Adam Peak from ICANN staff, who works the civil society engagement, to moderate this session. He's sort of neutral party with strict instructions to keep speakers on the line, not talking too much. Without further ado, over to you, Adam.
Thank you, Tapani. Good afternoon, everyone. So we're talking about civil society experiences with the IANA transition. I think the focus is actually probably on the CCWG, the cross-community working group on accountability, but the broad topic is the IANA transition. A lot of people will have been here and heard, people like Larry Strickling tell us that the transition was the most successful demonstration of the multi-stakeholder approach we've seen to date, and I think that's probably true. I can't think of any other. I had the good fortune to work on the transition for about 6 months before turning over to civil society engagement and witnessed the work that was done, and it's extremely impressive, and I think the community should be proud of what they've done. It's been interesting afterwards that there's been a lot of very positive comments about the transition, very little negativity, which again is something that's a good thing for us, but am I being over enthusiastic? It is a very good example of multi-stakeholder engagement and achievement, and there hasn't been a great deal of criticism of the outcome. We're ongoing with work in Workstream 2, but I think that what we'd like to hear today is both from you about the successes, the work that you did, and where the work is continuing. And that is what I understand this session is going to be about. So we're going to begin. Unfortunately, Robin is not feeling very well today and Robin Gross cannot make the session. But we're going to begin by talking about the key issues for civil society during the transition debates. And to fill in on the beginning, we'd like to hear some comments on civil society's concerns and positions on issues of transparency and accountability as they were discussed, as they appeared in the final recommendations, and then ongoing from there. And I wonder if Milton Muller and Farzaneh Badi would be kind enough to step in and make some initial comments on that set of two issues, accountability generally and then transparency. Thank you for
that. Greetings, everybody. So this is a little bit extemporaneous since I just learned about 5 minutes ago that I'm going to do it. But accountability or answerability, as some people might say, is one of the major problems with ICANN. It was noticed early on in its history. The issue at the very formation of ICANN was what keeps this organization accountable. Originally, the idea was that the board would have, the organization would have members, and those members would elect half the board, and then the supporting organizations would appoint half the board through their own internal processes. As we all know, elections were abolished. The initial board stayed in place for almost 3 years. And there was probably starting around 2008 or 9, there was kind of a crisis of accountability as we went into the new GTLD program. And the issue regarding the transition was always, if we can't go running to the U.S. government to complain about ICANN, who can we go to? And there are still very progressive people to this day who fear the fact that ICANN has been cut loose from this high-level form of external accountability. So the accountability process went through a really interesting and highly legalistic process of deciding how to replace ICANN replace the U.S. government oversight role. I'm sorry, not to replace ICANN. Nobody wants to do that. With respect to the IANA, there was a big debate about whether to pull IANA out of ICANN altogether and have it be a contracting company. And that idea was not able to achieve consensus. So they ended up with this PTI structure in which it is legally separated, but it is still a controlled affiliate of ICANN, but there's all kinds of oversight mechanisms and review mechanisms built around it. And then what most people were concerned about, and what became clearer and clearer as we went along in the process, was that most people were really concerned about the accountability of the policy-making process, not so much IANA per se. And that was where we got really complicated. We had to work within the framework of California law. And typically, civil society members were pushing for stronger accountability mechanisms, such as membership, that could, for example, remove board members or spill the entire board. Eventually, we ended up with this hybrid. I don't want to go too much into detail about California law, but we have something called an empowered community, which consists of representatives of the advisory committees and supporting organizations. And if enough of these ACs and SOs decide to do something, then they really have some formal authority under the bylaws to fire the board, reverse a decision, remove board members, and so on. Now, in addition to this empowered community accountability, you have two other important forms of accountability. One is the independent review process, in which you can appeal decisions as being inconsistent with the bylaws. And we're still in the process of implementing the IRP, and there are some issues with that I'll probably bring up later. And there is lost my train of thought. The fact that the board cannot change the bylaws now without approval of the community, particularly a set of special bylaws called the fundamental bylaws, so that in the past there were instances, for example, when ICANN lost an independent review appeal, the board quickly changed the rules of what it took to win an independent review appeal, and that can no longer happen, and that's a very important form of reform. So that's a quick overview of the accountability reforms. Do you want me to explain more about how civil society related to other interest groups, or is that enough? Is that all you want at this point?
I think just generally if we can keep it to around 3 to 4, for all the speakers, 3 to 4 minutes. But if you want to say a little bit more about how civil society either was particularly involved, if there was any particular aspect of that you thought was pertinent to civil society's either interests or even successes in driving something through those recommendations and change.
Well, I think civil society was a critical part of the separation of PTI from ICANN. We wanted something a bit more strong in terms of the structural separation, but we did get some form of separation. Civil society had some important role in the transparency procedures, which I think Farzi will talk about. And we had a big debate within the concept of the empowered community about the role of the GAC and the role of governments in that. And I think civil society was concerned about whether the GAC had privileged powers and tried very hard to limit those powers. And again, as with PTI, we reached a middle ground which was acceptable but not particularly wonderful for all parties involved.
One of the things we'll try and do is leave question and answer to the end, and that will also be for remote participants. Thank you, Milton. So unless there's some massively urgent clarifying sort of comment or question as we're going forward, then we'll leave question and answers to the final 15 or 20 minutes. And Alan has one. Yes?
I just wanted to interject that not all of civil society was uniform. At large considers itself part of civil society, and we didn't necessarily agree with what everything that Milton was saying was a civil society position. So,
What a surprise.
not at all, just clarifying.
It's healthy, isn't it? Farzaneh, would you? Thank you very much.
How am I supposed to reach this far? Okay. Farzaneh Badi. So I was involved briefly with the transparency efforts at the accountability working group in the work stream 1, and there was this major problem with ICANN document disclosure policy that they had these broad criteria that they could just reject document disclosure requests, and so what we tried to do, we tried to look at these criteria and bring reason why these criteria should change and kind of make it more open for the community to ask for certain documents that are not published. And so this was a good effort we actually achieved because in the work stream 2 now we are working on those criteria and other things to make ICANN more transparent. And also as to the transparency of the, for example, for GAC and the board, some of the deliberation of the board, it was pressed upon that it should, some of their deliberations should be transparent and open. Also, GAC discussions should be also open and transparent. That's about it.
So, thank you. I mean, one of the things we're going to be, I can see a lot of people who are very familiar with ICANN here because they're members of committees and board members and so on and so forth. But a couple of things. We will be mentioning things like Workstream 1 and Workstream 2. And Workstream 1 with the accountability mechanisms for enhancing ICANN accountability that were deemed necessary to be in place, committed to, so that this transition could go ahead. So all of those have been completed or committed to, and that is when we're talking about Workstream 1. Workstream 2 were the issues that were felt that had to be put in place but could be worked upon after the transition. So Workstream 2 issues are ongoing now, and we have issues around diversity in ICANN, support, and then supporting organisation and other volunteer participation, accountability, staff accountability, transparency, which Farzaneh's just mentioned, human rights issues, which we'll discuss, jurisdiction, the ICANN board, ombudsman, and working on some other bylaws issues. So there's work that's already been implemented that was part of the transition, but there's also work that's ongoing. And it's back to you, I'm afraid, Farzaneh, because the next part of the agenda is to talk about community and staff accountability, which I...
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm going to be very brief here because, well, there's a lot to say, but we have 9 speakers on this panel. So as to the staff accountability, we have a group that is working on staff, ICANN staff accountability. And the reason behind working on the staff accountability is that because staff is in charge of kind of, well, most of the time coming up with the reports and also implementing the recommendations of the community and writing down, for example, that was Robin. Can we just tell her to come here? And yes, and and for example, if staff can advise the community on the process and that advice is not correct, well, I think staff members should be accountable for such actions. So that's what, that's the reason behind it. That's why we have the staff accountability, to see how we can actually have staff accountable to the community. And we are working on coming up with recommendation for enhancing the supporting organizations and advisory committees accountability. So to whom are they accountable? We discussed this a lot, and for what they're accountable. To whom they're accountable, to their stakeholder groups that are, and designated community that are indicated in the bylaws. And for what they are accountable, we are it's about representation, and so that the SONAC, and also SONAC should not be captured, so there should be mechanisms for preventing capture, and these are the things that we are now discussing on how to enhance the accountability of the SONAC. And I have to say that these mechanisms already exist in SONACs, they just have to be enhanced after the IANA transition. Thank you.
Thank you. So it's trying to apply some of the same standards that were applied to the board into the organizations that are developing policy. Is that one of the notions?
Well, no, not all the criteria, because, well, there are diverging views about this. Some argue that we are like the communities, like the voters, and you cannot put the same standards on the voters and the same stand as you do on the ones that want to get elected, like the board. So we cannot have exactly the same standards. That's what we are discussing, but yeah.
Thank you. Well, that gives a nice segue back to Milton, because we're jumping around the agenda a little bit, which you're looking quizzical about, but I thought anyway, because the next discussion of thinking of voters and those that are empowered is to talk about civil society's interests and concerns about the new roles of government that have been brought into place through the accountability, through the recommendations and implementation of the new bylaws. So, any further, I know you began to touch on that in your previous comments, but if you can expand on civil society's views, taking into account Alan's point on governments.
Right. Yes. So, yes, in this particular case, there was a very obvious distinction between most of the civil society people and the interests of the at-large, which, as an advisory committee, tended to support more power for advisory committees, oddly enough. So there was a big debate about the GAC, and ICANN's status as a non-governmental form of governance is very unique, and many people have always been concerned about governments inserting themselves and taking over, whereas at the same time, some governments viewed themselves as being powerless in this environment and giving advice which the board didn't always follow. And there have always been tensions caused by the fact that we put governments in a room by themselves at ICANN meetings. They develop their own ideas about what the policy should be. In the meantime, the rest of the community is over here developing policy, and at the end, the policy goes to the board from the GNSO, and then the GAC gives them advice, and you enter into negotiations between the board and the GAC. And there can be a lot of conflict over that process. Now, one of the key issues was the GAC operational rules, which means that when the GAC gives advice, what are the requirements for it to be considered advice, formal advice under the bylaws? Because if it is considered advice, that means that the board has to enter into a negotiation process with the GAC, And even though it can ultimately reject that advice, it has to go through a long process, and it is pressured by the bylaws to come to a reconciliation with the GAC position. So the GAC really has a lot of last-minute kind of hold-up power over the policymaking process. So the reform process wanted to make sure that the GAC could only offer formal advice if it had complete consensus among its members, which meant that no member of the GAC, no state anywhere in the world would object to the advice. As long as there was one objection, then the GAC could not be offering formal advice. And the GAC, some GAC members, at least a faction of the GAC, didn't like this requirement at all and fought very hard against it. And to cut a long story short, basically there was a bargain at the end where they said, in order to overturn GAC advice, we'll make it a little higher threshold. You need one more vote on the board. However, GAC must offer advice through a formal consensus-making process. The other controversial thing about the GAC was, is it a member of the community at all? Should it be a member of the community, or should it be outside that community offering advice? It seemed to civil society, many of them, that the GAC wanted to play it both ways. They wanted to be a voting member of the empowered community, but they also wanted to have this special role of offering advice under the bylaws. And civil society members, at least in the non-commercial stakeholder group, were very much against this and wanted them to make a choice. Either you're just another stakeholder group and your advice has no more authority than anybody else's, or you have special advice powers, but you're not a member of the empowered community. The compromise that was reached here was that they did become a member of the empowered community. Many of us are still uncomfortable with that. We think that if there is fights over censorship or rights, that governments might have trouble supporting the community on challenges to the ICANN board's power, because the ICANN board might be trying to sell out to governments. On the other hand, what we learned during the process also was that GAC has trouble making up its mind, especially if they have a consensus requirement. And many, many times we were just sitting around waiting for the GAC to tell us what the heck they wanted or what was their decision. So maybe the dangers of the GAC are somewhat mitigated by the fact that they do have this consensus requirement. But if the consensus requirement goes away and you have strict voting, majority voting or even supermajority voting among governments, I think you're in a very dangerous situation vis-a-vis the status of ICANN as a non-governmental governance regime.
It's one of the more complicated parts of the concerns over well, not concerns, but how we've developed the policy here. We have Robin back in the room, and thank you. I hope you're feeling better. And would you like to jump back in and make a few comments on accountability and transparency? I think transparency first is covered, but you do have some points.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? Do I need this closer yet? Is that better? Okay, great. Hi, my name is Robin Gross with IP Justice and the Non-Commercial Users at ICANN. So I want to just back up a little bit and talk about one of the reasons.
You'll see when you're being heard.
Okay, thanks. Some of the reasons why we had to create these accountability reforms. So a couple of years ago, when we heard there may be a transition, pretty much everyone in the ICANN community joined together and said there can be no IANA transition without accountability. And right now, ICANN lacks accountability, and so we need to do some fixes in that department before we can have an IANA transition. And really, this was an unprecedented movement, because all of the stakeholder groups, everyone from the governments to civil society to business to the contracted parties, were pretty much all on the same page on this. And so it was the diverse stakeholders that agreed that we need accountability reforms before there can be any IANA transition. And the U.S. government seemed to agree with the community and said that ICANN had to listen to the community and undertake some of these reforms before there can be the IANA transition, before that could even occur. So some of the problems that led to this feeling were routine violations of ICANN's bylaws, problems with issuing top-down policies that contradicted, often superseded the bottom-up developed policies, concern about empire building within the larger internet governance space, for example, here at the IGF or Net Mundial, concerns about mission creep. The intellectual property constituency is very keen on getting ICANN to get involved in enforcement and expansion of intellectual property rights. There's concern about some staff favoritism, staff interference at ICANN in the community's work, and really no effective means of requiring ICANN to follow its own rules and to serve the community. There was concern about a culture of opacity and non-transparency, concern that the board was not adequately supervising the staff. Reconsideration requests for board decisions were routinely denied. So there was a lot of concern about what were some of the problems with respect to ICANN accountability that needed to be fixed before we could have an IANA transition. So one of the major reforms was the creation of this empowered community, which is all these different stakeholders come together and basically are granted new rights over the board and some oversight of the organization. So the empowered community was created basically as a check on the ICANN board and staff. And some of the rights that were granted to the empowered community were things like the right to recall board members, which is pretty typical in a traditional not-for-profit organization or organization generally. We had the right previously to appoint board members, but we didn't have the right to recall them. So that was one of the major reforms. Another had to do with the empowered community having oversight on the budget and the strategic plan that ICANN put forward. And another important reform was having the independent review panel process, or the IRP as it's called, being more effective and more accessible to the community with respect to noncompliance of some of these ICANN policies and bylaws. So the empowered community, the creation of that concept was a major reform platform and included a number of these rights. And of course, one of the major reforms also had to do with increasing transparency at ICANN, because the concern was that how can ICANN be accountable to the community if the community doesn't even really know what is happening, what is going on. We needed more transparency. And so we had reforms, for example, and some of these reforms, particularly these transparency reforms, are still in play. They're still being worked out in Workstream 2. So there is still opportunity to get engaged and to join in some of these working groups and work on some of these transparency reforms. For example, reforming the Document Information Disclosure Policy, which is akin to the Freedom of Information Act in the US, where you can get access to documents and information that led to the decisions that were being made. More transparency with respect to board deliberations. Really trying to create a culture of transparency at ICANN, turning that around. We need more transparency with respect to discussions with governments and the lobbying that goes on. And we need more improvements with respect to ICANN's whistleblowing policy. So these are some of the transparency reforms that are currently underway. That there's still, this work is not at all complete. So there's still a lot of opportunity to get involved in the next couple of months and get engaged in some of these transparency reforms and some of these other accountability reforms in what we're calling Workstream 2 at ICANN. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello. Well, never mind. Like a Dalek or something. We got, I think Robin's call for help is particularly important. The thing about Workstream 2 is we have a set of discrete issues that that people can get involved with. I think many people, I mean, you can see around the room, many people are involved with ICANN, but the issues are complex and they are many, and if you're working on some of them, it takes an enormous amount of time and a great range of knowledge. But what we're looking at with some of the Workstream 2 issues are really a call for expertise on quite specific topics. An expert who understands transparency and bringing transparency to organizations. And our next speaker, at the end, Niels, is going to talk about human rights. And I think that's also a very good example of the type of specific expertise and knowledge that can be brought into this process, and calling to people at the IGF to get involved and help people like Niels, who is most definitely an expert. So thank you. Continue.
Thank you very much, Adam. And before starting yet another monologue on issues, I'm going to ask stuff from you people, so you're going to get active. So I'd like you all to raise your hand right now. Raise your hand, everyone in the audience. You can take your hand down if you do not know the meaning of an acronym. GAC, PTI, CCWG, WS2, NCUC, ALAC, IANA, SO, AC. So everyone who has their hands up, it's not about you. So who are the people who did not have their hands up? Could they now put their hands up in the end? Excellent. So you're the audience.
I'll bet most people don't know what the current definition of PTI is, only the old one.
Very good. So let's not dive into the connoisseur's taste debate, right? We have ICANN meetings for that. So I think what we're here about is to show how people can engage, and especially civil society, in this process. And ICANN is not only relevant because of the domain name system, because actually that's a relatively small part. But another reason to have a closer look at ICANN is that it's somehow developed model for the multi-stakeholder model. So it's also interesting for people from governance studies or people who are interested in deliberative democracy and things like that. So try also looking at that through that lens. And also then try to understand how all these acronyms are prohibiting other people from participation, right? It is what anthropologists sometimes call argot, which is a language that shows who is in and who is out. Right? So if we really want to make this a credible instrument and a way of doing governance, as what is the IANA transition was partially about, is that we should make it really accessible for everyone and not only the experts. Because last ICANN meeting, I realized it was the first time I did not feel a complete outsider anymore, after 2 years of participating. And that both frightened me and made me happy at the same time, you know, you can understand. So a bit over a year ago, 1.5 years ago, we asked the chairman of the board, Dr. Steve Crocker, what he thought about ICANN and human rights. And he replied that human rights were all fine and good, but he had no idea what it had to do with ICANN. And here we are, 1.5 years later. We have a commitment to human rights in ICANN's core values. So that is an example of how things, when you swim through the sea of abbreviations, can get done. Well, can get done a bit. Because the commitment to human rights that we managed to get in ICANN's bylaws is kind of a bracketed bylaw, or a sleeping bylaw that will only become active once a framework of interpretation has been developed. And that's what we are currently working on in Workstream 2. So again, the work streams, Workstream 1 was everything that happened up to the transition, so that was October 30th. Workstream 2 is everything that happens after. And that is actually exactly a risk, because there is the risk of Workstream 2 becoming the graveyard of the potential of the IANA transition. So let's make sure that all the things that we said that we should do during workstream 1 and that we would do during workstream 2, that we really get that done. Now, for the human rights work, we're making some good progress. The first draft of the framework of interpretation, we've reached agreement on that, consensus, in a subgroup. And we're now going to discuss it in the plenary of the cross-community working group on enhancing ICANN's accountability. And then the next part of our work will be how do we go forward? What would a framework of implementation look like? And we have things to look at examples that have been made, how other parts of the internet are doing so. But this is really pioneering work, because we still haven't really worked out in detail how non-state actors ensure that they respect human rights, but multi-stakeholder bodies and internet governance like ICANN are also still a very strange beast for that concept. So if you want to join, it's a very interesting challenge. You can make a change and you will learn a lot. So if you want, you can join the traveling circus.
Animals or clowns, or I'm not sure what we are in all of this, but
Lots of clowns.
lots of clowns. Well, thank you. I think, well, so Niels, is that a success or a failure of ICANN process so far? Because that's the next subject, really, is successes and failures of where we are in civil society's view. It sounds like you're saying that, you know, from 18 months ago there was a major barrier, and now we're at least moving ahead. The circus is...
Well, the circus always continues, right? That's the thing. And I think declaring success is something that you should leave to historians. Because we're still so close to where we are. But I think what we have achieved is agreement and a language within the community to make progress. And so I've maybe been a bit disingenuous when I talked about all the language and the abbreviations. Because maybe this language is exactly what we need to connect people from the very technical communities, diplomatic communities, civil society communities. We share different backgrounds, different knowledge, also factual different languages, and sometimes to reach agreement you need to invent new words and new concepts in a negotiation to make a step ahead. So that is exactly what we're doing, and whether that actually works remains to be seen, but I'm very hopeful.
Right, thank you. Because the next part we're going to have two speakers. So Arti Bhavana, who's been one of the organisers of the session, will talk about a point of view as a newcomer. I think you joined into the CCWG accountability work as someone who was quite new to ICANN and then got very much involved, and your organisation is producing a lot of good work. So that's one point of view, the sort of barriers from a newcomer's perspective. And then Jan-Alt Schulte will talk about the perspective he had as an expert advisor to the accountability working group, barriers, successes, challenges, and all of those things. So I think if we can have those 2 points of view with about 4 or 5 minutes each, that would be an interesting way to move forward with this. So Arti, if you would
thanks,
take
Adil.
that on.
Hi, I'm Arti Bhavna with the Center for Communication Governance. We're an academic research organization based out of a law university in Delhi. So we have been following this process, especially the CCWG accountability process, fairly closely over the last couple of years, with participating in the public comments as well as the calls and the mailing lists. But and this has been a very fascinating study of multi-stakeholderism, which is something you tend to usually just read about. But here, this was a very real-world case that you were part of on a day-to-day basis, that you could see. Where you could understand the way the different stakeholders are coming together, presenting their views, the differences in opinions, the similarities in opinions across stakeholder groups. So we recently came out with a report where we studied Indian stakeholder participation at various IG fora, including ICANN. But we plan to extend this to CCWG accountability as well, because this is an extremely interesting example to look at how even to see the diversity of views that exists even within a stakeholder group, as was mentioned a little while ago. The IANA transition was a huge draw for newcomers. It is a huge, it was something that drew the attention of the world and brought in a lot of new, fresh blood to the table. So I'd like to take a couple of moments to just talk about what it was like as a newcomer to participate in this process. So first of all, when I joined, I jumped right in the middle of, I think, the second public comment process that is going on of CCWG accountability. So it takes months to be able to catch up to where the discussion is at. And something that I thought could definitely help, while you have to do all the reading and you have to go through the mailing lists and the call transcripts, but one thing I thought that could help is what some PDP working groups do at ICANN is that they have monthly updates of discussions that took place. They have summaries, and that is something that definitely could help not just newcomers but also people who aren't following the process as closely. We try to do that with blog posts that summarize these things, but while that was possible in Workstream 1, it becomes a lot more complicated in Workstream 2, where there are 8 or 9 different subgroups, each of which have at least 1 or 2 calls a week. Another barrier is that not only does the catch-up period take a lot of time, but the continued time commitment that is required, which is a huge barrier to anyone wanting to join the process. But I really don't see a way around that, but it's definitely something that is worth considering. Another thing that I noticed was that a lot of discussions tend to revolve around a few people. It's the same few people who are talking about multiple issues. And while that does bring in an element of stability and continuity, it becomes extremely difficult for someone new who's trying to join in the process. One thing that does help and that you learn over time is that a way to break into this would be through your stakeholder groups or through your constituencies. So working through the NCSG, for example, to raise your concerns and having that then in turn raised at CCWG accountability is an example. But that is something that newcomers would take a while to figure out, because being on a CCWG call where there are, say, anywhere between 60 and 100 people, and you're trying to raise an intervention or you're trying to raise a point, can be pretty overwhelming for quite a while, actually, not just the initial few months that you're on it. But overall, this has been an extremely fascinating process, and it remains to be so even with Workstream 2, which has a lot more extremely important issues that are being discussed. So that's all from me for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, the issue of newcomers being heard is quite familiar. People will say that you can watch on mailing lists and somebody will make a point and then it'll be generally ignored, and then one of the more experienced members will make the same point and everyone sort of responds. And that sounds like being a man as well, but there you go. If you see what I mean from that, sorry. Jan, if you would like to make a few comments, please.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks for organizing and inviting. I was indeed I don't know what I was in this process. I think I was called an advisor. I'm not sure how expert I was. Yeah, I'm not sure about the expert bit, but anyway, I was an advisor in the process. But I think I was called in because I was a researcher on civil society and global governance. And in a sense, I was the same as Arti. I was also a newcomer. I'd never been in this space at all. So I'm making observations of a similar kind to some extent. I was asked by the organizers to emphasize the limits to participation. So I want to qualify this. I'm going to follow my orders. But if I wasn't given those orders, I would have done all these marvelous things that happened, and all these, because I do think that it's been an incredible experience and incredibly creative and the like. But I've been asked to emphasize the lack of complete openness. So I've got 5 points along those lines. But maybe also say civil society as a terminology in ICANN is a little bit ambiguous. I think we're using it to mean the non-commercial users constituency plus ALAC, the at-large advisory committee. But many people would regard business constituencies and business associations as opposed to firms themselves as being part of civil society. And technical associations would be part of civil society. So, and I think even the term civil society, I've been witness in these 2 years to some quite heated debates about whether the terminology of civil society should be used in ICANN at all. Anyway, so just put that as a background. But on these limitations, I observed civil society in general to be somewhat on the sidelines when it came to crucial junctures in the transition discussions. So yes, on the mailing lists, and yes, on the meeting hours and all that, but relative to business, technical, and government communities, I think the role was relatively secondary on the whole. And at the crucial moments, the discussions that were outside the room, that were in the corridors, that were in the back rooms, that were, I was party to a number of those things in the advisor role, I have to say. And at those moments, civil society really wasn't there in terms of the NCUC and ALAC. So I think it's good to be aware of where you weren't, as well as where you were.
Can you identify those moments?
Well, a lot of it would be in terms of being in back, but well, let's say that there were calls. There were calls that board and so on would make, that sometimes came to us as advisors, and there was no civil society involvement. These calls were not public. I don't think I should go into more detail. Let's just say that there were occasions and meetings and calls. I don't think, no matter how much is on transcripts and all the rest, a lot of stuff still happens on the phone behind the scenes. And I think that's when it gets really crucial and tough, and then deals are done behind the scenes and then presented in the open forum, and then everyone rallies around. This is real politics. It's real politics. I wouldn't over-romanticize the multi-stakeholder arrangement. There's a lot of really exciting things. I would much prefer it to any other political process that I've observed, but it's a political process. And people are trying to reach goals, and people have divergent power positions, and they will use those power positions when it comes down to it. So anyway, that's and I would say the limit, maybe a limited scope of, and a second limit is the limited scope of civil society. I think by civil society we're talking about NGOs and research institutes. And in particular, social movements were not involved in these processes. So civil society is formally organized, legally constituted, professionally staffed. That's the civil society that was in the IANA transition, and a wider civil society, which would probably regard the characterization of the process as being bottom up, as being rather curious. In other words, I mean, those social movements that are at the bottom of society would probably say that this was actually quite top-down in a curious sort of way. That anyway, people's definition of bottom-up are relative, I guess, is what I would. Depends on where you're looking from. A limitation, maybe also, it's been mentioned sometimes, access, resources. There's such high barriers to entry. Artie and I have been fortunate enough to be able to get into this process, but you know, why? Because, well, we had to be very quick in learning the technicalities of jargon and acronyms and so on and so forth, and like Neil says, it's after 2 years that you begin to feel like, oh, you can finally string these sentences together. You need considerable funding. You need a lot of money to be able to do this. And really, the remote participation is definitely secondary. It's definitely secondary. All those discussions in the corridors and so on that are really influential in all this, you can never do that when you're remote. You need high English fluency, and really high English fluency. I think the native speakers don't realize how much people who are non-native speakers are struggling to follow. And all the humor and everything else that comes in. It's really quite difficult there. A lot of cultural codes about dress, public speaking, mailing lists, chat rooms, all of that. You got to know how to do it. It's a global tribe that's moving around. You know, you have to know how the global tribe works, and most people find that quite difficult. And then the social capital of being recognized as a member of the group. I know that I walked in the first meeting. It's like, who are you? So that all of that takes. So I think there's some you become part of the gang, and that's great. But it's only then that you begin to have more influence as part of civil society. And I think that one should be a little bit honest about that. And there are I think some bigger structural hierarchies, geopolitical. I mean, you look around those IANA transition discussion rooms, and the civil society that was participating too. A little bit of civil society from India, which Artie is an example, but the civil society that participated on the whole was North American and European. Very little civil society participation from other parts of the world, and no participation from rural areas. Everybody was from urban areas. So those are, those are big parts of civil society that are not there. Age, class, race, gender, sexual orientation, I mean, you name it. The civil society, it reflects and reproduces the structural hierarchies of society at large, and there's nothing different. There's nothing different here. I'm not saying that it's horrible, just think, you recognize it.
I don't know what you're comparing ICANN to. Like, what is your, what is your, to what are you comparing? So what are your expectations based on? Are you comparing ICANN to a kind of like a international organization or like a government? These expectations are just too high for, I think, such organization.
They're not expectations, they're observations. They're observations rather than expectations. The observation would be that if you went to the World Social Forum, for example, as a civil society space, you would find, I think, different varieties of the social complexion, the cultural complexion, the range of argumentation would be different than what you find here. I think it came up, I was quite struck, I don't know if you, in the opening session, there was someone from IT for Change who made a talk. And I'm not necessarily endorsing the talk, but they talked about things like the despotism of a datafied world and digital capitalism and its consumptive character, the predatory internet, and so on and so forth. I'm not saying that I necessarily endorse it, but it really showed where the limits of the discussion of civil society insiders would be, and that kind of discussion would be outside. And that's just it's an observation. It's not an endorsement or otherwise. Anyway, sorry, I've gone on too long.
Thank you. I think it's very interesting. And as we come towards questions and answers and comments, then it'd be interesting to know if people have answers to these problems. Do we have ways to do it better? But that's not where we're at in the agenda at the moment. I'd like Matthew Shears to come in and talk a little bit about what he thinks went well from a civil society perspective. And then we'll run on to some thoughts on strategies for the future. And we'll have Matt will talk a little bit to introduce those thoughts. And then we'll have Alan Greenberg will, I think, talk a little bit about civil society's thoughts for how to go forward in this. Marilia Marcial will do the same thing on those topics. And Klaus Stoll, thank you, at the end of the table to do the same. What should civil society be doing as a strategy, both within this process, but also perhaps thinking about some of Jan's questions, or comments. I know you've only just heard them, but if you have a response to those, and then we can perhaps have questions and comments from everybody else. But Matt, over to you, please.
This is quite an interesting discussion, and Jan, thank you for taking it to another level of interesting. That was very good, and I'll come back to the comments you made in a minute. So a bit like Niels, I came into this process at the beginning, at the time when the transition was announced, working for CDT and doing internet governance. It was decided in the organization that this was probably the most important internet governance issue that we would face for this period of time, and therefore we should be involved. So coming in, I had none of this background or understanding of the stakeholders or the kind of intricacies and things that you get from being an ICANN for a period of time. So it was a little bit of an interesting learning experience for me as well. What I did have, though, was a general understanding and awareness and experience in the internet governance space as a whole, and that was a significant leg up when it came to understanding the ICANN environment. So if you're already in the space, not necessarily an ICANN, it makes it a whole lot easier. And I think, the point that Jan is making about how representative and how much diversity there was in, for example, civil society, or for that matter, across the stakeholders as a whole, I think we just have to be very careful about how we look at that, because at the end of the day, what ICANN does and the space that ICANN sits in and its role, and therefore the stakeholders that engage in it, is necessarily limited. And so I think we have to be careful about how we look and what we compare ourselves to. So what did we get out of this? If you had come to the session, I think most were here actually at the session yesterday evening on ICANN post-transition. And there was a whole series of, I asked much the same question, which was what were the success factors. I'm not going to go through them because there were a couple of pages of them. And I think that from a civil society perspective, though, there were some important learnings that people have touched upon so far. And I'm going to exaggerate them a little bit, okay, so for my civil society colleagues, don't jump all over me. I think what the IANA process did is it showed us the absolute value of having a common goal across the stakeholders. All too often we find ourselves at odds as stakeholders within ICANN, and having this common goal, which in many ways was imposed from outside of ICANN, and then further elaborated on by our own communities, was incredibly valuable. And what that common goal did is it forced us to be cooperative. It forced us to compromise. It forced us to sit with individuals from other stakeholder groups. And all of those things within the framing of the ICANN work in the IANA process really helped bring, I think, another level of awareness to how we can work together on issues constructively. It also encouraged us to be flexible but still firm. Jan may have a point about some of the backroom discussions, but I think we have to be careful here also that we don't attribute some special magic dust process to multi-stakeholderism and multi-stakeholder models or multi-stakeholder working groups. At the end of the day, what we're talking about is group dynamics amongst a group of stakeholders that are often at odds with each other and are all seeking power of some sort or another within the construct that's ICANN. So to think there wouldn't be backroom deals going on is frankly naive. I mean, that's just the way these group dynamics work. So I think we also have to be careful in that sense in terms of understanding that these things aren't special to ICANN or to the CCWGs. This is just the way we work as human beings and as social entities. So I think the big learnings, and certainly from my perspective, was how important it was to sit down with other stakeholders and how important it was to reach across the aisle and actually to get up at that whiteboard or that flipboard during the times we were doing the stress tests and work on them together, or to talk through the various options there were for PTI. We came at some of these issues from completely different directions. I came into this discussion with a clear idea I wanted to see a completely separated IANA functions. Well, it didn't work out that way. But I think at the end of the day, what we got was as good as we were probably going to get with the parties and the interests that were around the table. And I think that, at the end of the day, is what prevailed, that sense of common purpose. And I think, unfortunately, that sense of common purpose can very quickly dissipate, and I'll come to that in a minute. So a couple of things, a couple of thoughts in terms of what do we need to be careful of or wary of, or what can we build on going forward. There are things that came out of the IANA transition work that have been touched upon already continue to bedevil civil society, and I think these are the issues that we need to think about quite strongly when we go forward and think about the future. We have a participation challenge. We still have a participation challenge in ICANN. We certainly have a participation challenge in NCUC and civil society as a whole. But again, I think we have to balance that against the resources are available, the space that we're in, which is a small, very small, detailed, defined space that not many people want to operate in the first place. So, we need that little bit of a reality check there. We also have the core versus periphery. I think, Artie, you said it, there's always the 4 people who are doing all the work. Well, that's absolutely true. But again, that's a group dynamic thing. But that same challenge that we found in ICANN, we find in civil society in ICANN more broadly. So again, we need to think about how we address that going forward. It's not gone away. It's still there. But it's more a function of group dynamics than actually of anything else. So I think, again, something for us to address as we go forward. And the important learning coming out of the IANA working groups was that we can actually get over that. We can actually bring people in. We can actually co-chair. Niels has only been in the ICANN space for 2 years. Well, it might seem like an age, but he's co-chairing, or in fact, in many ways, chairing. So, this can happen. So you can get beyond the 3 or 4 people at the core. The difficulties we face, I think, are not so much about resources or funding, and people will take me to task on this. It's not so much about the language, but it's about the expertise that you can bring to the table, because that is where the difficulty lies. There is a huge amount of arcana in all of what goes on at ICANN, across the different policy development processes, across the whole scope and of the organization, etc. And that expertise is something you only get by being in this space for a considerable period of time, and that's just a reality. So bringing people up to speed as fast as you can is great, but this is still a limitation. And we have to deal with that as a civil society. A couple of other things. Accountability. Accountability is a key issue that we've dealt with vis-a-vis ICANN. We're now dealing in Workstream 2 vis-a-vis the supporting organizations and the advisory committees, but we also need to deal with it ourselves. And this is another issue that we can't duck, and we need to continue to work at it. And then finally, again, I'm going to come back to one thing that I think is really important. We work together across stakeholders. The moment, and now this is my personal experience, the moment that transition occurred, we've seen a falling back into our stakeholder silos. Interests and concerns that were there before the work have bubbled to the surface again. Just when, for example, we're thinking about how do we change the bylaws in the different parts of the community to reflect the ICANN's new bylaws, we're already seeing these things come back to the surface. So I would urge this community to think, how do we keep that common purpose alive when we're looking at the future? How do we continue to work with stakeholders and hopefully work constructively, compromise when we need to, but let's not compromise too much. Make sure it's across the board compromise, and I think we can find ways forward. So I hope that set this up a little bit for the next part of the conversation. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you, Matt. So yes, let's move ahead. And Alan, would you like to think about the strategies for the future and how we're responding to the accountability developments and post-IANA?
Sure. Thank you. I'll talk a little bit about our experience in the process first, because the answer to your question is it directly follows from it. As you can see from the little interaction between Milton and I at the beginning, we were not necessarily in lockstep with much of civil society on many of the issues. Others, we were very much in agreement, but there certainly were some strong differences. We ended up in a position where I think we were pretty well satisfied with most of what we ended up with. In some cases it was a hard time getting there, but certainly we were moderately satisfied. How we did it, I think, is perhaps a lesson in going forward. We had a pretty good commitment of people working on both the CWG stewardship and the CCWG accountability. Between 5 and 7 people heavily committed to it in terms of either being members or being very, very active participants. Despite Jan's comment, from all regions, we had a lot of very active participation from Africa, for instance, which was relatively uncommon in the groups as a whole. We worked as a team. Although we often disagreed with each other on specific points, and if you listen to the various people talking, you'd see that. But overall, those differences were also discussed outside of the actual meetings. We had coordination meetings that rivaled the number of hours that the CCWG and CWG held. That was not only coordination meetings of the people involved in the group, but a much wider community. So when we went into a meeting, we could speak with some assurance. We were talking about what at large felt, not just what the person who was speaking felt. And as I said, occasionally there were differences. That prep work, I think, helped a lot because it allowed us to look at the various options and try to understand what we really wanted to achieve, and at the same time, what we could live with. And at almost every junction point, we outlined both of those. So sure, we're going to push for this, but we can live with something else. Those changed over the period of time as the things that particularly the CCWG were looking at varied, and the models we looked at varied heavily over time. we had moving targets on both what we wanted to achieve, what we thought we might be able to sell, and what we could live with. And I think going into it with that kind of prep work allowed us to both speak with a somewhat unified voice, occasionally not, but usually, and I think that was one of the things that helped us move forward. At the same time, we did lots of backroom corridor discussions with other people, trying to find common ground, both with other parts of civil society, with other parts of the ICANN community overall, to try to make sure that what we were talking about was something that was going to be saleable. There was no way we were going to get what we wanted to the exclusion of everything else. And I think that overall methodology that we used then is a good model for moving forward and how do we do it. And we're continuing that on the Workstream 2 work as well. Thank you.
Merlia, would you like to follow on from there, please?
Thank you very much, Adam. This is Marilia speaking. I was asked to talk about some lessons learned and looking forward, and I thought that with so many experts on the transition in the room, maybe it will be more useful if I try to draw a conclusion between two multi-stakeholder processes that produced very concrete outcomes. One is the IANA transition, of course, and the second one is the Net Mondial meeting. And it's interesting because I'm sure that most of you are familiar with it, but it was a meeting organized in 2014 by Brazil. After the Snowden revelations, the mood was extremely tense, and it was a meeting that turned a very bad environment in which trust was punctured, fragmentation was the order of the day, into something positive. It created the environment for a positive multi-stakeholder collective response to a challenge. So I think that some interesting lessons can be drawn if we compare the two processes. But the first point that I would like to make is the need for us to document the IANA transition. And I say that because after Net Mundial, one of the papers that I wrote was a case study on Net Mundial. And the effort to do it was completely Herculean, because it's not about going to the official documents that you can find on the website. If you try to document a process like this, you need to go to the drafting documents, negotiation positions. So much valuable material is exchanged through emails, for instance. Not all the lists are public. In ICANN, many lists are public, or all the lists are public, but you need to know what you're looking for to find an email in the pile of emails that get exchanged in this mailing list. So it's very hard for someone who is not deeply involved in the process to be able to document. So one of the things that I urge is for us to document this process, because I am sure that it will be extremely valuable when another moment similar to this one comes up and we can talk about the lessons that we learned in a very concrete and fundamented manner. But I think that what both processes have in common is that they show that it was possible to produce a concrete multi-stakeholder outcome. For those of us that are in this internet governance environment for many years, we know that this was a taboo. Many people said that spaces that are multi-stakeholder, like the IGF, they were just too diverse to produce something that was meaningful. And I think that the IANA transition showed that it is possible for the community to work together, and so did Net Mundial. So just trying to go back to a few lessons that we extracted from the case study in Net Mundial and try to bring them here to the table. The first one is that trust is key to the process to work. In Net Mundial, trust was pretty much based on the people that were involved in the process. Each stakeholder group selected their representatives to the committees that organized Net Mundial, that helped to draft the outcome document. In ICANN, it seems that trust was very much placed in the process itself. The multi-stakeholder dialogue that happened in the transition was very much structured. The parameters for the transition were very clearly put forth by the NTIA. We knew what we had to do for the transition to be approved. We knew which were the red lights, and this was something very important. And there were also clear rules of engagement. So if you wanted to participate, you knew exactly what to do to be part of one of these committees. So building trust into the process is something very important. If you can align trust into the process and trust into the people, then even better. The second lesson from Net Mundial is that the multi-stakeholder committees were a very important way to really engage the communities, to give this bottom-up nature to the outcomes that were produced. It's very important to reach out to the grassroots levels of each constituency, and the fact that the composition of these groups reflected the constituencies is very important. In Net Mundial, we had the multi-stakeholder groups that drafted the outcome text. In the IANA transition, we had the transition coordination group, we had the CCWG accountability, so the fact that we express the diversity of the community into these working groups is very important as well. The third one would be a specialization of tasks and the assistance of experts. The topics are so diverse that you cannot just expect to understand everything. If you go into accountability discussions, the person that gets very specialized on what is going on in human rights will probably not be the same one that gets specialized on transparency. So we need people that are really digging deep into different expertises, and we need to bring many times external experts to the process. That's what we did in Net Mundial in the last phases of drafting the document. There were organizations there that were specialized in human rights. We have here in the IANA transition organizations like Article 19 and others that got involved into the process. And when we specialize and we put name tags into the boxes that we are discussing, it becomes visible as well that we are talking about human rights. If you don't divide the topics, maybe for Article 19, would not be clear for them what they're going to do in the IANA transition. It's not my field. But because we said there's a human rights discussion, then they understood the process, they found their box, and they became involved. So this specialization is important as well. The importance of on-site participation and online participation. This is something that ICANN does very well. And I do take the point that many times if you don't attend the meetings, you miss the corridor dynamics. But on the IANA transition process, most of the decisions or the outcomes were defined online because people were not seeing each other. They were spread all across the globe. So the moments in which the discussions really moved forward were during the calls. So it helps to leverage the playing field for those that cannot really attend the meetings face-to-face, and that was a very good thing. Another thing that I think that we need to document somehow is the US dynamics after we had the proposal. Because that was an entirely different chapter, and not only civil society, but other actors from across the globe. When the transition started to be an issue in the US Congress, we just lost the capacity to participate. And I think that organizations in the US did a very good job in following up the discussion in the Congress, and what they did on the national level is very important to document and to take into consideration as well. So let's document this process while we can and while it is fresh in our memories. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a couple of PhD topics, I think, for somebody. Milton, you can get a few of those together. Study the transition and create a doctor. Klaus, please, if you would make some observations.
Okay, looks like I'm the last, so let's go back to the circus. So the circus took 2.5 years or so and put together the best possible program. We are all proud of it. It's a wonderful program. But yes, we worked together and it worked. But what about our audience? And I think we have to look at, in the future, we have to do two things. We have to actually let the world know that ICANN exists, that these processes exist, and not be a circus which tiptoes, where the elephants tiptoes into town in the middle of the night and the lions have taken a vow of silence. We really have to become more vocal about internet governance and what we're actually doing. The second part is quite simply, I think we forgot one fundamental basics is of what we are doing. And what we are trying to do is a secure and stable DNS. This is a product. But I think the value proposal, which is the DNS did so well over the last so many years, is now getting lost more and more to the people who are actually using the internet. The reasons for that might be just simple things like social media, but there's also privacy, security, and things like that. We have to work on re-establishing the value proposal of the DNS. The second point, and I'm coming very near all the time to Matthew, if you might have noticed. The second thing is that, yes, we have in our circus the jugglers, we have the people who train animals, we have people who play the band, and whilst we constructed our wonderful program, we worked together, but now we are all come back to doing our own thing and forgotten that our product, our show is 10 times better when we actually have an elephant, a lion riding an elephant and have some music on top of it. So we have to do that to learn and to get that culture of actually working together and not just trying to find always the compromise by talking things out, but also to think about and work on learning and cooperating by doing. I think the outcomes are much better if we trying to work on the win-win situations and look at just simply what is the lowest possible common determinator. And the last one that I changed just this morning because I mentioned it before and Farzaneh corrected me and she's absolutely right. So the third point is we have to free the slaves. In civil society, we are really in a situation where, and you all mentioned it in one way or another, all the people we are dealing with are financed in one way or another. Matthew is right when he says you need a long, long time, and if you're not able to do that, you can't develop that expertise and knowledge and in-depth and equality and widespread of opinions and so on. So what we have to do as a civil society, look now also how we actually can get ourselves in a more fair financial footing and get these things going. I think there are models and there are ways. It's just now the time after the IANA transition to seriously look and say, hey, how can we deal with that? So I know this all has been said before, but I thought it just might repeating, and hail to the traveling circus. I mean, as Afri once said, I mean, the internet has that curious urge to travel, and I think that's just a wonderful sentence.
She is right. We do tend to travel rather a lot. So thank you very much. We just got two people asking for the floor. So first of all over here, and then the gentleman here. I'll begin. I think I stole the mobile mic, so I'll start walking around.
Thank you, Adams. Sorry. Mawaki Chango, and I was a member of the NCUC constituency some time ago. That was, sorry? Well, not active now, but I once was active and a representative on GNSO Council. I just wanted to get back to the observations made by Jan Art and the questions that were raised right after that. The first question was, what were the expectations and what was he comparing to? And he's right to say those are observations. But if you want to frame it in terms of expectations, I would say the words that we use, there are expectations embedded in them. When you say we are civil society, and someone observes that there are out there a lot of civil society movements that are not reflected in your civil society, then they will observe why not? Why we are observing all those civil society components that are outside and they are not reflected here. So I think it's a legitimate question to be raised. And I think it was Matthew, is it Matthew, who at the end of his intervention said the crucial problem that we have is the availability of expertise. But, well, yes, that's true, but the expertise, you gain it in a language. There are a lot of people trying to attend this meeting, trying to keep up with the output and all the work that is going on, but because it is in English, they don't race at the same pace as you, and they won't gain that expertise as quickly as you. So that's a main problem, and it's not that long ago that all the ICANN documents were exclusively produced in English. That was not long ago. And even now that they are produced in multiple languages, most of the time, if not all the time, those are the final documents that are translated in those multiple languages. So there's a lot of work that is involved in getting to those final documents. How do you want to get people from different corners of the world speaking, not being that comfortable in English as you, to contribute expertise? If they are not contributing, it's not because they are lacking expertise, but they don't have the language to convey their insights and maybe the expertise that they've got. So I just want to encourage you not to downplay those challenges and try to improve things on that. Thank you.
Thank you. If you could take the mic across to the
Just
oh, your mic works, right.
Seems to. So my name's Toby Mendel. I am with the Centre for Law and Democracy. It's a human rights organization based in Canada. My main comment is about transparency, but I will just make a quick comment on the participation issue. It's my first, I'm going to confess, it's my first IGF meeting, and I suspect that most of the criticisms that were made about participation, I mean, I don't know because I haven't sort of seen it in practice, but my gut feeling is that they're probably correct, but I'm also a little bit sympathetic to your question, so sort of how do you compare us? Because the other sort of multi-stakeholder forums that I've been involved in, and by the way, I'm here instead of at the OGP in Paris, which was unfortunately timed at the same time, another big meeting, I think that this one is a lot better, that we're having this discussion at all. I was surprised to see that you can register as a newbie and get sort of assistance and whatever. But one criticism, which has an implicit recommendation in it, this session, like so many of the ones that I participated in here, has had far too many speakers, far too aspirational time limits, which were not enforced, leading to the result that there was less than 10 minutes for audience participation and questions, which is not only a participatory failure, but also, I think, an efficiency challenge, because I presume that there's a lot of expertise around the room that could have been engaged better. In terms of transparency, it is an area which my organization is highly specialized in, and although I haven't been involved in it at all, my colleague, Michael Karanikolis, I think, I see people nodding their heads, he's been quite engaged on this. I don't know exactly, I was sort of desperately emailing him trying to get the latest update, which he didn't send me because he was just walking out the door. But I think there are some, from my long experience working in this area, I would just point to some headwinds and maybe end up with one recommendation. Many people have said that this is an odd-looking beast. It's not an NGO, it's not an IGO, sort of a multi-stakeholder governance entity was used to describe it. I don't even know what that is. But and I think that's a challenge in terms of looking for models, and the kinds of places you're going to look. NGOs and IGOs have very poor track records on transparency and transparency policies. So please don't look to those constituencies. I think it's essential for ICANN, and other people have mentioned it, but it's essential that the transparency policy that comes out is a robust, world-leading one. I think that there's a real opportunity within this forum, within ICANN to set strong standards globally for that. Some headwinds, though. It took us, the openness community, 10 years of sort of heavy battling with the international financial institutions to shift them, because they had started out in the wrong way. way. And I mean, you know, if you do that, it's going to take 10 years to move from that too. So learn from that experience. There will be a lot of opposition. There will be a lot of players. I mean, there always are a lot of players that are resistant to openness, especially the kind of you know, radical moves of openness that are now becoming commonplace at the national level due to technologies and just changing values around information. And then finally, in terms of my recommendation, I mean, I think it's probably an area where civil society, whatever exactly that is, but quite a few of the stakeholders can probably come together and form a strong lobby. It's an area where we find that it's very easy to unite, you know, stakeholders who are more outside of the process when the governments and power brokers inside of the process are resistant to that. So I think sort of, bringing together civil society really strongly to fight hard for top-level transparency, a very important goal.
Thank you. Yes, you're absolutely right about the timing, and I apologize for that as the moderator of the session. We have a remote question. Thank you. Yes, if you could go to that, and then yes, the remote question, and then I had Matt and Farzaneh and gentleman here. But if you'd read the remote, that would be great.
Okay, we have a remote participation from, I'm sorry for the pronunciation, Gangesh Varma, who states, "Hello everyone, apologies for not being there in person. I'll start with a big thank you to all the speakers and participants for sharing their insights. This was a very engaging discussion that has brought out so many different dimensions to this topic. When civil society is put into monolithic block, its inherently diverse nature and rather fragmented views on various issues are challenges to working any multi-stakeholder model. My question, where did you observe the most during the IANA transition? Examples of substantive issues. And given this given the continuing opportunity with Work Stream 2, how can this challenge be addressed in the future from a procedural perspective? A related point for discussion is consensus building. Aligning point of view is desirable for civil society actors? If yes, then how best can we achieve this? My question is open to anyone wishing to share their perspective on this, but I would love to hear Professor Schultz and Professor Meyer's thoughts.
I think we're out of time to answer the question, but we do have it on record, and the non-commercial stakeholders group can look at it and take it. Can I ask the people who've spoken? There's a gentleman here who hasn't spoken. I don't recognize you, so somebody who might be new to ICANN, if you would like to make a comment or an observation or a question, then and then we will.
Can I ask my question?
Yes,
or
please.
just
Yeah,
comment?
and it may be difficult to answer,
Yeah.
but at least we can hear it. And
Thank you. My name is Ali Akbar Musavi, an internet freedom advocate and a former member of parliament in Iran, and its vice chair of ICT committee at the time. I have two questions. I understand that the previous CEO of ICANN, Mr. Shahada, testified in Congress about this proposal, and later on, I think in September 2016, the new CEO testified again in Congress about this proposal. I would like to get an update from the position of Congress, because it should be approved there, I think, the proposal. And the second question, my second question is that, you know that after the election, US election, because this proposal and all activities and development happened during Obama administration. So what is your expectation, your analysis that what's going to happen later on in the new administration, the position of new administration, US administration in that regard? Thank you very much.
Just very, very quickly on that is that the transition has occurred, so the United States government no longer has its previous role. It has stepped back and is ended. So the Congress has no particular role as of now. And it would be what happens in the future, but there are positions on this, so I'll probably try and find them and share them with you. Thank you. We have to close the session. Thank you very much to the remote moderator. Thank you to the speakers and everybody else. And so you can close the thing. Thank you very much.